Hi friends, how are you? It's Kate Lanagan MacGregor, and I am extremely happy to be hanging out with you and talking about one of my favorite topics. And right now I'm just going to turn on the chat and take a peek to see who's here with me. And okay, so I turned on the chat and I see my name. Can you guys pop your name in and let's get it rolling. Okay. So one of the things I like to do is I like to jump right into the topic, and that way we can start talking. The difference between these live webinars and the showcase is that we talk a lot about storytelling in this, right? So this is where we can get the war stories that kind of connect with the content, so that it sometimes gives you context, right? So that's the first thing that happens. And the second is that you've got a lot more chance to jump in and ask questions. So I will be watching the chat as I'm talking, so I'll keep my fabulous glasses on. And I'm going to dig right in, though, because it's a lot of content, and I want to try to keep us to our time. Does that make sense? We also have a Module 1 coming up after, if it's something that you're interested in. All right. Let me just take a peek. So let's see who's here. Okay. All right. Awesome. So please put your name in that, and I'm going to start the slide presentation. Okay. So anyway. So we are going to talk about Unit 4, which is, we're going to start with Unit 4, which is forms of real estate ownership. And as I do that, one of the things I want to do is I want to make sure that I can see my chat. Okay. Hi, Zach. How are you? So Zach, are you ready to roll? Now remember, what I'm looking for, and I can see my chat the whole time we're doing this, is I'm looking for your questions, and I'm going to be telling some stories. Okay. And we're going to kind of go through what's in Module 4 or Module 2, which starts with Unit 4. Okay, which is types of real estate owner. All right, so one of the ways that I just like to always start this with is to talk about maximizing your time doing the studying. A lot of times people will say something to me like, can I really get all this done in 40 hours? I'm like, no, you cannot learn everything you need to know in 40 hours. You can maximize the time that you're spending doing it, though, so that the time that you're spending is quality hours. It's funny because no one ever asks us to, well, so far, no one ever says, can you show all their hours? Because, you have to take a test at the end, and the test is challenging sometimes. So we want to make sure that we have that. So again, have your book open to the unit, and we said this is Unit 2, right? And again, units are the general, they're yellow, and then chapters are red, they're the state, okay? So, and then you're going to want to have your recorder ready. So a couple things that have happened that people have done for training, one of them is that they will audio the whole thing that I'm doing in order to listen to it no matter where they are, okay? The other is that they audio themselves and they say, she just made this good point about this, this explains this, and they use it for their notes. So it's up to you on how you want to use that recorder at this point in time. Because I'm not going to stop, the way that you can stop it on a showcase to stop and go back and check stuff out. So we're not really going to be having it that way. But you're going to be recording the progress as you go. And again, I think it's really valuable to be listening to this information after. I think it's even more valuable when you listen to yourself. All right, so you can email me. I've got my phone right here. Although I would say the only time to email me would be if you had a private question. I've got my phone open, okay, and then you can chat with us. We have the chat going right now, all right? So thank you for being here, and let's dig in, okay? So when I say forms of real estate ownership, what do I mean by that? And here's like the background to it, if you will, is although the forms of ownership available are controlled by state law, real estate may be held in one of three basic ways. They include ownership in severalty, one owner. And again, if you remember that glossary that I talked about, several, T or whatever means one, right? So the definition is one, right? Co-ownership, which is more than one owner, and ownership by a trust, which is property held for the benefit of another, okay? So three different ways that you could own home ownership. So some of our objectives in this unit are going to be to define and explain the distinction between ownership in severalty and co-ownership. All right, so single ownership and co-ownership. Describe the various forms of co-ownership in real estate. And this is so perfect because we were just talking about this. Describe the key elements of trusts, partnerships, corporations, and LLCs. and identify and describe the types of property ownership for common interest property. Okay, so those are some of our objectives. Now I'm going to read through these. Now this is something that's different between the showcase and here. On the showcase, I will go through and I will read you the definitions right after the words. And that way you can hear it, you can see it, and you know where it comes from, what unit it's in. So I think that when we talked about you recording your own glossary, right? We said go to the end of the book and go through with your audio on your phone, which on your iPhone looks like a heartbeat, right? And go through and just read into your phone. So in this case, what you'd be looking like is something like this, right? You'd be going administrator, blah, 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 co-ownership, blah, 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 blah. And you would be alphabetically going through all of them. So the benefit of doing it both ways, so doing it that way, is that you take it out of the context of what chapter or unit it's in. And when you're looking at them now, it gives you the context. So it's nice to mix it up, and it's also nice to know where it goes. So the words, okay, the words that we're going to be talking about are administrator, co-ownership, codicil, common elements, community property, condominium, conveyance, corporation, cooperative, corporation, curtsy, decedent, descent, deturnable fee estate, dower, executor, heir, holographic will, incorporeal right, joint tenancy, wink, wink, land trust, legacy, legally competent parties, life tenant, limited liability company or LLC, minor, model real estate, timeshare act, non-cupative will, partition, partnership, PIT, right? Power of attorney, public ownership, separate property, severalty, tenancy by the entirety, tenancy in common, testamentary trust, timeshare, townhouse, trustee, trust, Uniform Partnership Act, unity of ownership, and unity of possession. Okay, so what you could do with yourself right now when you go to replay on this or whatever is you could stop the audio and then go and record all of your definitions for those, okay? So let's start with ownership and severalty, okay? In ownership and severalty, property is owned by one individual, one corporation, or one other entity, okay? So again, it's seen by the law and it's seen by statute as being one, even if it's a corporation or whatever the group is. Okay, so then there's also co-ownership, and that's where each person has a different role in it. And then ownership by two or more individuals. So those are all part of ownership and severalty. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back on that one. So ownership and severalty is the first, which is property is owned by one individual, corporation, or other entity. And then we also have co-ownership and then ownership of two or more individuals. And that co-ownership, the ways of co-ownership could be tenancy in common, joint tenancy, tenancy by entirety, and community property. So let's just talk about those a little bit. And I'm not sure if we talk about these a little bit later, but just for now, let's just go through what we got. All right, I'm actually going to go back to this one. So co-ownership. So co-ownership would be any two or more people who own something together. Okay, and that definition is right there. Ownership by two or more individuals. Other forms is tenancy in common. And again, tenancy in common would be a case of when these co-owners each own their share, and their share would have the right to pass on to their heirs. Okay, so they each own, again, as I talked about it, as like a piece of the pizza, right? They own that pizza pie, right? And the general examples that I can see in this is if it's unmarried couples purchasing together would be possibly tenancy in common, or people who have been divorced and are together after, and they want to make sure that they have their heirs get their property, or that they can pass it forward. Okay, so tenancy in common is what they will do if they are putting together a If the lawyers don't know what to put it as, what they'll put it as is tenancy in common. Okay, and it would be up to the person who's buying that property to say how they want ownership if it's not tenancy in common. All right, joint tenancy. So our joint tenancy has and I'm going to quiz you right now. We've got the P stands for possession, right? So it's PIT is our acronym. I is interest. They all have the same interest in the property. T is time. And what's the last T? Did you find out today? Okay. There's a little lag, so I'm just going to have to wait till I hear what you say. Okay, and I will come back to that. Then tenancy by entirety. So tenancy by entirety is married couples, and the presumption there is that, unless otherwise indicated, then the heir would get the married couple, the married other person would have ownership after, unless something else was indicated. Okay, and community property would be that people own in a community, they own their property together, so that could be any different types of things. Okay, but that would be called co-ownership for that. Okay, so trusts and business organizations. So living and testamentary trusts. Basically on a trust is that whoever owns it for the purpose of someone else, right? Land trusts, we see a lot of those. That's that a group owns it again for somebody else to use, right? The use is for the people who live in the area or whatever. Business organizations. So business organizations can have co-ownership, right? A partnership, right? A partnership would be where two people somehow own the property or business or whatever it is, whatever the asset is together. Okay, and they both have individuals' rights at that point in time. Now, corporation means that, again, corporation is seen as what? As one, right? As in severalty. So it's owned in severalty. It's owned by the corporation. Okay, so in a partnership, it would be owned. Title, they're right. So they take title at the same time, right? So they take title at the same time. Thank you, Zach. Possession, interest, title, and time. Okay. And so, back to my corporation. So corporation means that they are seen as one, right? And then a limited liability company is kind of like a hybrid between a corporation, but also giving some individual rights to it as well. So it's limited liability, right? So that would be how they would talk about that. So now for condominiums, the condominiums ownership means that, basically on a condominium ownership, you would own what's inside your walls, okay? And then what would happen is that you would also have common shares in the other parts that you share. So for example, the hallways, the stairs, the parking lots, the tennis courts, the beach, the pool, right? So you have you have a share ownership in that. So that's a common ownership. Okay, but what you own is inside your walls. So when people are being negative about condos, they say, well, what do you own? You own air, right? And, the common, like your roof is common ownership and stuff like that. So, so the common elements are co-owned. And then there's a thing called the right of first refusal, which means that in a condominium, the condominium association has right of first refusal when it comes time to sell. Okay, so they have to say that they don't want it before you can sell it to somebody else. And one of the things that is part of the condominium ownership is your HOA, which is your homeowners association fees. Okay, so those would be the fees that are collected for all of those common elements that you own together. So how do you take care of the roof? How do you take care of the snowplow? How do you take care of the parking lots? So your HOA fees are a part of what your monthly amount is. So the interesting thing that comes is that when you are working with a person who's buying a single family home, the number that they can afford in their mortgage is one amount. And then when they go to buy a condo, it's going to be less. So they're approved for less because they're going to have to factor in those HOA fees. Okay. So when you have somebody, let's say that's at a $250,000 pre-approval, they would not be approved for $250,000 on a condo because you'd have to figure in those HOA fees. Okay, so HOA fees are a big part of the condo equation. Okay, so another type ownership, which we don't see a lot of around here, to be honest with you, And I'm sorry, I'm drinking right into my mic, so I'm sorry about that. So the cooperative ownership is that the ownership, the co-op, right, is owned by a corporation. All right. And so a corporation, which is what, a severalty, right, owns title to the property. And then what they do is they sell shares of stock to the people who would either own the homes or the apartments. Okay, so they would own a co-op. Now, some interesting things about this would this be considered real property or would this be considered personal property? Okay, would a co-op be considered real property or would it be considered personal property? That's my question for you. Okay, and I gotta wait to see what your answer is. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you some examples of why people, where we see co-ops in general and what some of the things are that are kind of interesting. So co-ops are like in big cities, like New York has a ton of co-ops. Okay, that's the best place to look. And I always think about like the story about like, and the thing is that if it's a corporation and it's the stockholders that get the rights to decide who gets in there and who doesn't get in there, right? Because if they have the right to approve it, there is this form of discrimination. I know it's almost like legal discrimination because it is not real property, no, Zach. It's personal property because you own stock, right? And then the stocks or the shares of that in the corporation, then they give you the rights or the license to the apartment or whatever that you have for your co-op. So there's a story about how Donald Trump on one of his co-ops did not want like notorious people there or something, which I just find so ironic. Oh, look at that. I was worried about my drinking my water in my mic, but my mic's not plugged in. So I'm just going to plug my mic in so that you can hear me a little bit better. I might be a little echoey. Okay, does that sound better? So anyways, Madonna wanted to have a co-op in one of his buildings, and he said no to Madonna. So that's kind of a funny story, but that kind of shows us, some of the features of co-op ownership. Okay, so it's personal property. All right, now condos are real property because even though you own inside the walls, you do have a physical, tangible thing that it is that you own. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference there. And then then our third type thing that goes with these is timeshares, right? So timeshares are those. It sounded clearer without the mic? Okay, so I'll take the mic off. Okay. I can't get it out. For some reason I start sounding echoey, just let me know, okay? All right, so timeshare ownership. Timeshare ownership means that you own a property for a little period of time. Oftentimes it's either 2 weeks a year or whatever. And what generally happens is, as they call it timeshare estate, which is what you own, and then it's timeshare use, which is when your rights are to use it. Okay, so that's what timeshare ownership is. And again, if there's a question on that, when they give you for owning and they put in an element of time in there, like that would be a little hint for you that they're talking about timeshare ownership. Okay, so the corresponding chapter, so in our state that talks about forms of real estate ownership, is chapter 5. At least I think it's chapter 5. I know that both have just transitioned, so you kind of have to hang with me on that one. Okay, so estate and common. Okay, also, so estate and tenancy, those are words that are interchangeable. Okay, so when you see that on the test, if they talk about estate or they talk about tenancy, you'll know that it's the same thing. Okay. So in Massachusetts, it's presumed that when a deed conveys land to 2 or more people or to a husband and wife, except if it is a mortgage, a devise, or a conveyance in trust, it is conveying ownership as estates in common, unless there is evidence that another form of ownership was intended. So I'll give you a story about, kind of something that's kind of new for us. Yeah, so funny, Mariah. So my daughter just trying to find me, and she has the that little button that follows wherever I am. So she knows where I am. All right, so I'm sorry. So right when they acknowledged same-sex marriages as being legal, right? I had a married couple buying a house, and the lawyer did not know that they were married. So he had them as tenancy in common on the deed. And so we were at my office, which also had the law office there. In a corporation that has multiple owners, would that also be? No. Okay, it's in severalty. Good question, Zach. So the corporation probably would not serve the test of the PITT. Okay, so it would be severalty because of that. Okay, because it's seen, a corporation is seen as one body, even if there's 100 people, 1,000 people, whatever, working for that corporation is one being. Okay, and so that's where that severalty comes in. It's interesting because the word sever means like cut off, right? So like severalty to me does not mean one, like in my brain. I had to get used to that. So joint tenancy again has to be those four things. Good question. All right. So in Massachusetts, it's presumed that when a deed conveys, so the deed was created as a tenancy in common. So we sat down at the closing table, and the women kind of like pushed the deed away, and they said, "No, we are married. We want tenancy by entirety." And the lawyer, was his first time, with a same-sex marriage, and they had just become legal, and he was just like, he didn't know what to do. So the general rule of thumb is that, unless it's otherwise stated, it's estate or tenancy in common. Tenants in common do not have the right of survivorship between owners and may sell or give away their ownership interest. Okay, so back to what I talked about. Estate in common is that pizza, right? The pizza that says that I have my piece that I can give away, I can sell my ownership interest when I pass away. If I pass away while I still own this, then what happens is my piece goes to my heirs, right? So that's tenancy in common, okay? Another distinction of tenants in common is that the ownership interest does not need to be equal. Again, back to what I talked about with that pizza. It doesn't have to be equal size slices of the pie. Upon the death of a tenant in common, the estate is probated in order to transfer ownership interest to the lines of descent, okay? Now, our joint tenancy, which is the other way of the other method of co-ownership. And there's four main elements indicate a joint tenancy ownership, okay? And that would be the joint tenant owns an undivided interest in the property as a whole, and each share is equal, okay? So again, my eggs, my flour, my sugar, all mixed up together, they all own an undivided interest in that, okay? And the share is equal. All right, all joint tenants own for exactly the same period of time, in this case, for the tenant's lifetime, right? So they begin the tenancy together, okay? And they own it for the exact same period of time. Now, when that person dies, right, we talked about that. And again, the joint tenants receive and maintain their ownership under the same title, okay? So it's one title, and it's, again, it's that cake, okay? All joint tenants enjoy the same rights until one of them dies, okay? Now, when one of them dies, under the right of survivorship, right? So this is one of the rights, right? That when they talk about, again, this is one of the things that took me a long time to understand. If the death of one joint tenant automatically transfers the remainder of the property in equal parts to the survivors of the joint tenancy. And when only one joint tenant is left alive, he receives the entire estate. Okay, so that's how joint tenancy works. So does that help from what we talked about earlier? All right, so tenancy by entirety is created when the conveying deed is expressly transferred to the property to X and to Y as tenancy by entirety. And the conveyance is to a married couple. So this would not be engaged. They have to be married, okay? And not all married people choose tenancy by entirety. Again, we talked about why some of the reasons why they wouldn't want to. Okay, so what about a partnership ownership? So we talked about partners, right, which is co-owning, right, and they own something together. Partnership ownership results if partnership funds are used in the purchase of a property by persons who are partners. Okay, so then there'd be a partnership ownership. And Massachusetts law has adopted the Uniform Partnership Act under terms in which a partner may purchase a property with the partnership funds in his own individual name. Okay, so let's read that again. The Massachusetts has adopted under the Uniform Partnership Act, under the terms of which a partner may purchase a property with partnership funds in his own individual name. Okay, Now, that being said, the property does not have to be in the partnership's name. Now, that being said also, I think both partners have rights, even if it's in one person's name. All right, so cooperatives, condominiums, and timeshares. And then to foster the development of safe, decent, and affordable housing, the state encourages the establishment of multifamily housing cooperative associations. So when the state is looking for other ways of getting more people to be able to have home ownership, because there's an issue, there's a challenge, and that, trying to get people to be able to afford that American dream, let's say. Okay, so following statutory requirements, a special kind of corporation is established in which an individual unit residents own stock in the corporation and receive a proprietary lease. So this is co-ops, entitling her to occupy a specific unit in the building and to use the common areas. Again, in the case I gave you before, Mrs. Madonna could not get that co-op, right? So she was not able to purchase those. So Mass General Law, Chapter 183A says condominium ownership is a real property interest. Condominiums, real property. So I quizzed you on this earlier. Combining mixed forms of ownership. For example, joint tenancy with an estate in common. So you can have mixed forms of ownership on that. What condominium means is exercise dominion with others. Okay, so that common area that you have, that's called exercise dominion with others. Again, I don't know that no one's ever come back from the test and said that that's how they worded it on there. So let's talk about condo conversion. And I think that you have an example of, this might be something that's in your future. Okay. So condominium conversion is when they take those multifamilies and they decide to condoize and make it so that each person owns whatever the floor is. And my brother in the 80s, when he was in college, while I was up partying at UNH, he was in Northeastern buying multis with his best friend and turning them into condo conversions. Okay, in Mattapoisett, the Grange Hall was just changed from a apartments to condominiums. So there's a lot of different ways for having condominium conversion. So when they started happening, and again, as I go through these rules, I'm going to say, what my thought was when I was like you and I was learning this, and how I thought of these rules, and how since then I've learned a lot more, right? The owner has filed or intends to file a master deed converting the property to a condominium. Okay, so they have to file a master deed. Okay, now the tenant shall be given. I just did a class right before this, and my throat's getting a little sore, so I'm sorry. I'm going to be drinking my water. So the tenant shall be given a period of time to vacate based on the status as elderly, low to moderate income, handicapped, or other. So a lot of times, like back in Boston, when these condo conversions, these people were in, fixed rent controlled buildings, and they had this tiny little bit of, money, and that they were paying for rent, and real estate was booming all around it. So the tenant had to be given a period of time to vacate based on the status as, again, elderly, low to moderate income, or handicapped, or other, right? They also was given the chance to purchase the unit that they occupied at terms equal to or better than those offered to the general public. So they said, okay, so you've got a year to leave, and then in some vacate, and then in some instances, again, if they were elderly or low income or whatever, they had challenges, they would get an extra year, right? But they could also have the chance to purchase the building if they could. Yes, I do have to stay hydrated. That's right. Thank you. And then in addition to the normal property closing requirements, a condo requires two other things. So anyways, so back to my condo conversions. So one of the things that might be on the test is, this condo conversion, did they give enough time for this person to get out and find something else? Because what was happening was, before they had those in place, was that they would vacate this whole building because they were condoizing, and these people would have no place to go because they were rent controlled, and so they decided to give them a chance to stay. And I think that was something that was reasonable, and that is still in place. Now, so when you are doing a closing requirement, you need to have a 6D certificate and master insurance policy. So the 6D certificate is a certificate by the HOA, right? So that's our homeowners association. And sometimes it's whoever manages. It could be the homeowners association. It could be a professional organization that organizes it. They give a certificate that shows that those HOA fees are up to date, or if they're not up to date, what is owed. so that they get paid at closing. Okay. So again, one of the things that we can talk about was when the market crashed and these people started losing their condos, was that the whole association depends on everybody paying their fees in order to operate. And so if you had like 75% of the condos were either vacant or foreclosed on, who's paying the condo dues, right? And so one of the things that the condo association does now is they have to provide the 60 certificate showing exactly the status of those fees, and then a master insurance policy. So back to that same situation, making sure that there was insurance. And this is what we talked about before. Condominium buyers are often surprised to find the bank will allow them to buy a house that costs more than a condo, again, because of those HOA fees. In calculating how much a buyer can afford, most lenders will include the condo fees as a monthly expense. Okay, so again, if they don't pay them on a monthly basis, they will prorate it and they will divide it up to come up with that debt to equity ratio to see how much they can afford on each of their monthly bills or whatever. Okay, so in calculating how much of a buyer's monthly income is available to carry a mortgage, you got to include the condo fee. Okay, and that's why when you're looking at condos look like they're cheaper when you look online and you're like, wow, this is such a great deal. It's only $80,000. And then you got to find out what those condo fees are. Okay, so the Massachusetts Condominium Super Lien improves a condominium association right to collect unpaid condo fees in case of foreclosure. Okay, so what this super lien does, let me just see if it goes into better description on the next one. Yes, it allows a condominium association to collect up to 6 months of overdue condo fees after taxes and municipal debts have been paid, but before any mortgage obligations are paid. So they get escalated on who gets paid once you get that buyer's money, right? So what happens is that the money comes in from whoever's buying it, and it goes to first taxes and municipal debts, and then next would have been the mortgage. But the super lien lets the condo association get up to 6 months of uncollected HOA fees or association dues. Okay, and then it goes on to the mortgage. So not very often does something go in front of the mortgage. Okay, banks almost never get that. Banks always win, in my opinion. All right, so this is true even if the condo association lien is recorded after the mortgage or registry of deeds. So question for you. How do they decide when a property is sold, who gets that money first? Okay, so we start, right? We just started talking about that. So the taxes get paid, right? And then the municipal whatever the municipal taxes, if it's in tax title, right? So it goes to taxes and municipal debts. Then generally it goes to mortgage. And then after mortgage, how do they decide who gets the rest of that money? Okay. It has to do with, do you want to guess or do you want me to tell you? I feel like I should give you a minute to guess or to tell me that you already know this. So who gets paid after the mortgage? Generally speaking, taxes have been paid, municipal debts have been paid, and the mortgage has been paid. Okay, it goes to the registry of deeds, whoever has, in the order of which they recorded their lien on the property. So like a mechanic's lien or a credit card bill or something like that, it gets paid in the order of how they got registered. Okay, so here's what happens a lot of times is that somebody does some work on the house, right? And then the home seller does not pay them. Whether it's because they don't have the money or if it's because they just don't want to or they didn't like the work or whatever. But the mechanic, they always call it mechanic's lien, although it's anybody. It could be a home builder, it could be an electrician, it could be anybody. They would go down to the registry of deeds and put their bill that didn't get paid as a lien on the property. Okay, so say that happens, and then say 6 months later they default on their credit cards, and now Citibank wants to put a lien on it for theirs. So then Citibank puts their lien on it. And then another year later, they get another lien from something, whether they didn't, again, they didn't pay another person that did work on their house, right? So you've got all these people who have put their basically their request for money when the house gets sold on it, and then they wait until that money is doled out, basically, right? So if that first one was the who we say, the electrician that did the work, right? They get paid. Then whatever's left might go to that credit card company. They might get paid. And then if there's money after that left over, then it would go to the third person in line. Okay, so it goes by the order in which they were recorded. Now the condo super lien takes, no matter when it was recorded, and scoots it up so that it gets paid even before the mortgage. Okay, I think I'm killing this one with like a dead horse, but anyway. Okay, so timeshare ownership. In Massachusetts, you can find this in Mass General Law, Chapter 183B. And it says, in a timeshare arrangement, a parcel is held by several owners in common. Okay, so they own it as several owners in common. Okay, yep, I can go through that one more time. All right, so let's go back to, all right. So any property gets sold, right? The first place that money goes is to taxes. And how you will see this on the, like on the settlement statement, is generally like there's a spot for property taxes or whatever. And it might not even be that the taxes are late. Most of the time, they're not even late. They just are, they go to the town and they say, okay, because each town either puts the bill out to prepay it, or they go back and they go in that they call an arrears, and they go back and they get the bill. So if the person paid it and they prepaid it, then they actually get money back, right? But if they go and it's say that they're projecting it for the year, and they have to pay up to however long that they've been there, then they would pay the taxes. So the taxes get taken care of first, okay? And then any other municipal debts, again, water, final water reading. You'll have final water readings, and what will happen is that those will get paid right at closing, all right? It'll be right on the settlement statement. So those are the two kinds of things that are municipal debts: water and sewer, taxes, whatever. So they get taken care of, right? Then the mortgage gets paid. You'll see another line item there that they go and they pay off the mortgage of the seller before the seller's going to get any proceeds. Okay. Now, generally what happens, like 9 times out of 10, whatever's left after those things and after they do their adjustments and all that kind of stuff, the seller gets the rest of the money. Okay. Now, in the event that when they did a title search on the property and there were some liens put on the property, and my examples I gave you was that electrician that did work, that credit card company that you defaulted on, another person that you didn't pay or whatever. So they would go and they would put a lien on your property. And what they would say is, all right, I'm going to get paid when you sell the property. Okay. So if there's money left, they would then go to those next people, right? So it would be, but then it comes in the order that it was recorded. So if in 1980, that electrician did the work and he recorded that bill on 1980, then his would be from 1980. And then let's say that credit card was 1990, then it was 1990. And let's just say when you were getting ready to sell the house, you had someone do the Title V and you had no plans on paying them. Like they'd be third in line, right? So it would be third in line because of the date in which they recorded it. Now, if you're in a condominium and let's just say that you didn't pay the electrician in 1980 and in 1995, you didn't pay your HOA fees or your association fees and you were behind in your fees, right? And so then they put a lien on the property and then whatever else happened. And now you go to sell. The Condo Super Lien Act says that you could escalate it up so it gets before the mortgage. So 6 months goes to the condos, because what was happening was the condos couldn't run because they weren't getting money, because there was never any money left after the bank was done, right? So what was happening was the condo fees were just like out of luck. So what they said was, if we are trying to encourage condominiums and co-ops and, for different kinds of ways for people to live and have homes and have housing, then we have to bail them out a little bit. Okay. So that's why they put the super lien and they put it in between taxes and municipal, condo super lien. So 6 months of dues go to the condominium association and then it pays the mortgage. Okay. How's that? Right. Again, doesn't depend on when it was, even if that electrician put it in before it. All right. So in a timeshare arrangement, the parcel is held by several owners in common. Okay. And each owner has the right to use the property for a certain period of time, which may either be fixed or variable. You're welcome. So in this case, generally it's 1 week or 2 week, but sometimes they have that you always get it in April, but this time you want to do it in January and you swap it out or whatever. So, you have these different kinds of agreements on that. So in Massachusetts, an ownership interest in a unit that includes the right of possession during a potentially infinite number of separate periods is an estate in fee simple and includes all the rights of common law fee ownership. Okay, so what does that mean, right? So if an ownership interest in the unit includes the right to possess during a potentially infinite number of separate periods, it is an estate in fee simple. So that means that if it doesn't say, April 15th to April 25th, you get this. It says that you can switch it around or whatever. So it's an infinite number of separate periods. Number one, then it's an estate in fee simple. Now, fee simple is like the highest form of ownership, which we'll talk about later, right? And so this includes all the rights of common law fee ownership. So it means that when you're there, you get to use all of the rights of our bundle of rights that we're going to talk about, okay? I don't know if we talk about it today, but that bundle of rights, which is, which we'll talk about later, okay? So it says an interest in a unit that includes the right of possession during 5 or more separate time periods over a limited number of years that is greater than 5, including an extension and renewed options, is common law estate for years. So here's a tricky one for you, okay? Whenever they say tenancy for years, okay, what they're saying is that, so here it says like you've got specific time period, right? So there's a start date and an end date. Whenever there's an end date identified, it's an estate for years, okay? So when someone's taking out a lease and it's a short-term lease or it's a winter rental or it's whatever, if there's a date that they are out, it's an estate for years. So what they'll do on the test is they won't tell you, they won't make it a year, make it 9 months. So they'll make it, 6 months or whatever. And they'll give you all the different kinds of ways that it could be a rental. And you're like, oh yeah, that's not a year because it's only 9 months. And so you're like, it's not that one, but it is. If it has a specific date, okay, it's an estate for years. And then timeshare is under that. All right. Do we want to stretch a little? All right, I'm just a little back bend. Okay, so we're going to go into Unit 5. Again, it's Unit 5 when I did it. We're in the middle of transitioning the books, and it's just been crazy because people are just so confused, and I'm sorry about that. I don't know. There's no way that we can get everything converted over that fast. We've got a small team. So I apologize for that. But so go by the descriptions, land descriptions. There is a chart, I think, that Marie gave you all that shows the whole transition on it. All right, so land descriptions. A street address, while helpful for finding the location of a property or building, is not precise enough to define the perimeter of a parcel of land in a way that excludes all other parcels. A property description must be legally sufficient or described in a way that will enable a sales contract, deed, or mortgage document to be legally enforceable. A legal description is a detailed way of describing a parcel of land for such documents. The description is based on the information collected through a survey. Okay, so a lot of times, like in towns, there might be 1 or 2 main streets, or South Main Street and North Ave and North Road and North Street. And so a lot of times, just the street address is not considered sufficient to be the legal description of a property. Okay, so what we have around here is we have a few other ways that we identify that property, okay? So what we cover in this unit is identify and explain the methods used for describing real estate and explain the process involved in identifying and measuring property rights, including those above and below the surface, okay? All right, so our key terms in this unit are acre, air lots, area, baseline, benchmarks, datum, front footage, frontage, legal description, linear measurement, lot and block recorded plot method, meridian, meets and bounds method, monument, plot map, point of beginning, principal meridian, range, recorded plot, rectangular or government survey system, section, spot survey, tiers, township lines, uniqueness. Okay, so those were what our vocab words are. So again, if you were watching this on a replay and you want to stop this and go through those words and find your definitions and audio them, that's cool. You will get the replay on this, so you can do that the next time through, right? Now, whenever we do this unit, I always tell you guys that you don't have to worry about how to do the government survey. And people always freak out and they still figure that they better learn it just in case, and they don't need to know it, okay? There's a couple little things that they may ask you. One is, what is the square that the school is in, right? And then they also may ask for the total acreage or the total size. So we'll cover those, but that's all they're going to ask you, okay? Because it's not in place around here, right? It's for, we are one of the original colonies, and when they were dividing our land, they did it by creeks and rocks and stone walls, and it had nothing to do with the measurements of, like, when they went out west and they created these wild west, and they said, I'm going to take this block, I'm going to put my squares in this way and my squares in this way. There was no way to do that in New England. We just, that's why it's such a mess. And that's why people who've lived in a thing where they have had the government survey, they come here and they're like, oh my God, this is so confusing, So anyway, I think it's pretty interesting. So the methods for describing this is meets and bounds. So we do use meets and bounds. And what you will see when you go look up some of the deeds, and one of the things I want you to do before you do this work again, is go look up the deed of your house, your family house or whatever, and check out how it's identified. And if you really want to kind of, if it's an old house, is go back and see how it was identified until you go back, until you actually do see the creek and the rocks and the stone wall and the things that have all moved now, right? So it's pretty interesting. So that we've gotten a little bit better about it. So what they do when they find a point of beginning is they generally try to find a monument or a fixed object used to identify the point of beginning. So practically speaking, what we see most of the time now are like those granite markers that they use to do the landlines, right? So they're like this square, and they have these granite markers in the ground. In the event that there isn't one, sometimes there's a telephone pole. I know a lot of times when you, especially like on North Street, like the telephone pole to telephone pole, oftentimes are the landlines. Okay, or it might be, whatever. They identify what their point of beginning is. All right. They also, now they will use GPS coordinates sometimes, right? So they find the GPS coordinate, or they find it, through, a more scientific way, I guess, to find that point of beginning. And then they go, and they would then go, and what you'll see is they will go southwesterly, X amount of feet north, and south or whatever, and you pace it out or you roll it out, and that's how you come up with what the landlines are. So when you see a surveyor there doing that, what they're doing is they're going around the corners and around the corners. And it was interesting. I saw the house actually on North Street not too long ago. And when I was taking the listing, the owner said to me, oh, my fence is on the neighbor's backyard. And I'm like, oh. I'm like, well, we can move that, blah, blah, blah. He goes, no, I cemented it into the ground. And I'm like, oh, you did? He's like, yeah. And I said, did you know when you cemented it into the ground that it was not your land? And he said, yes, I did, but I wanted it. And I'm like, oh. So he's thinking in the back of his brain, like adverse possession, right? Which comes up in another chapter, right? So he's like, I'm going to openly and notoriously use it for a period of 20 years until I own it, right? That's his brain thinking. He had a pool, and he actually put a pool house in on their land, right? But he didn't know how much on their land. He was kind of off on it. So interestingly, we had a legal opinion done on what he had to do about the landlines and how far they were off or whatever, because he had it surveyed, right? And then what to do about the pool house or whatever. And so the interesting thing was that he's having all these things done, and then the buyers of the house wanted us to just take it down and just, get rid of the pool house and find where the landlines are and get the fences to be in alignment. So we had these two like pushes and pulls because we could. There's some laws, I guess, that you can go a foot away or whatever, and still keep your fence there or whatever. But anyways, when we went for the point of beginning, I literally, and I did a video and I'll put it up there, but I was like standing in the middle of the shed. Like this is where this boundary is. And then the next one I went over and it was like in the corner over by the other one. And so I don't know. Anyways, it was pretty interesting. So the points of beginning are very interesting. There's a house that I'm selling right now where there's a fence, and then no fence on one of the sides. And the reason for that is that when the gentleman bought the house who owned the land that abutted it, he thought that when he had his survey done, that it was on his land. So he took the fence down, and his people were wrong. Right. So, you get this push and pull all the time. So anyways, they look for those monuments and they cross it out. We have a lot of the points of beginning, and you'll find they normally identify it as POB. Okay. And then that's the monument that they come up with. Again, they've really gotten away from doing things like a stone wall or a stone or a creek or any of those things that are no longer identifiable. Right. So the rectangular government survey, as we talked about, which is what they use out west and all of these planned, states and whatever. And they're so easy to understand, right? Because the numbers go this way: First Street, Second Street, Third Street, and then it's A Street, B Street, D Street, right? Anyways, there's a principal meridian, and then there's different tiers and ranges. And a township is made up of a certain number. Have you gotten to this, Zach? Do you know how many blocks there are in a township? And then different sections. Okay, so we will talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go along. And then our third one is lot and block, which is our plots. So so the lot is, they take the town and they divide it up into different, maps or whatever. And then they go and they take the lot and the block and they divide it up. So when you go to, there you go, good job. Do you know which number is the school? Because if you do, then you're all set for the test for this question. So anyways, so a lot of times you will go and you'll see the lot and the block number in the subdivision plot, so there you go. You are going to do fine on this test. So anyway, those are identified generally. So when you are putting in your legal description, right, you could say, 123 Main Street, further identified on map blank and lot number and plot number, and so you can spell it out, and you'll see that a lot of times. And you'll also say like one in a single family dwelling on 1.5 acres plus or minus, so we identify as closely as we can what we're talking about, right? So again, the legal description comes in now when you are selling the property, when they're transferring the property over and they have a survey done. Now it's a survey sketch, and that survey sketch is actually done, by either going and taking a picture of the outside or doing it from GPS coordinates. Okay, so it's not like a survey just in order to move a property transfer it from one person to another in the conveyance. So I had a situation down on Point Connet, which is a beach down in Mattapoisett, where there was a shed that had, in the course of the hurricane, had like lifted and landed, and it was showing on the survey as like straddling the landline, right? So now they're like, all right, so that shed out there is a part on your property and part on the other person's property, and what do you want to do about that? So these kinds of things come up a lot, so there's a lot of encroachments that you see that are out there. Okay, and again, we'll talk about encroachments in at another time. So again, measuring elevations, and they talk about air lots and datum, right? And then, one of the reasons that this has become an issue around here is because of why. Will you tell me why? Well, I'll give you a hint. It has to do with a word I just said, and it has to. The elevations in town are being elevated for purposes of flood insurance and flood issues. So what happens is, once these benchmarks are out there and these datum are identified through town and they're shared and they're identified, then when the next person needs to go do their elevation certificate, they can use those monuments and those benchmarks for their own. Okay, so that person doesn't have to go and have everybody do the same thing over and over again, trying to find those elevations. So elevations are important because of building. Okay, and a lot of times when you go to different parts by the water, you'll see the elevation of a home or whatever, and a lot of that has to do with the building codes. Okay, and again, units of land measurements. What are some of the units of land measurements that you can think of? Okay, so some units of land measurements are acres, right? Square feet. So they go through the different kinds of ways of doing that. So I see that we're going on to another unit. I'm trying to think of what happened to my chapter on this. I don't know. So it'll come for us another point. How you doing? Are you still with me? All right, so we are going to now jump into interests in real estate. Okay, so interests in real estate have to do with ownership of a parcel of real estate includes all or something of the bundle of rights. So I talked earlier, acre, there you go. All right, so ownership of a parcel of real estate. Now, how many feet are in an acre? This actually, they give you this on the test, so you don't have to know this, but I'm going to tell you my brilliant way of remembering this. I'm going to write it down. Yes, good job. So you know how I remember that is I take that 4 and the 3 and I switch it, and then it's almost like counting, and then I switch it back for my acre. All right, beautiful. So it's 4, 3, 5, 6, 0 for those who are watching this in the replay. So that's how many feet are in an acre. Okay, so ownership of a parcel of real estate includes all of some of the bundle of rights, depending on the type of interest a person holds in the property. So earlier we were talking about timeshare ownership. And we talked about how they have, they have fee simple, right? If it's infinite, the number of times they can use it, they have a fee simple estate, right? So remember that as we're kind of mixing these together. All right. So interest in real estate. Ownership may be limited by public and private restrictions intended to ensure that one owner's use and enjoyment of the property owned does not interfere with others' use and enjoyment of their property or with the welfare of the general public. Okay. So one of the reasons why they did this, they have these bundle of rights, is that they want the person who owns this property to be able to have their enjoyment, okay, but not at the expense of their neighbors, okay, because everybody has rights to their own, okay. And so some of the objectives we're going to talk about is identify and describe the various types of estates. We're going to explain the difference between liens and other types of encumbrances. Right, we talked about liens when we talked about the order, right? Explain the limitations of private property rights for the welfare of the public. Okay, so the first is a fee simple estate. And so as I said, a fee simple estate is the highest form of ownership. That means it has the least amount of restrictions on it, okay? And so a fee simple estate is generally you purchase a property and you get a fee simple estate, which means that you have the highest form of ownership on that. Okay, you have those. So at the fee simple, you have all of the rights. So the rights are, and I think this comes up later, but I'm going to just jump ahead a little. Is the acronym DEEP C? Okay, so do you know what the DEEP C stands for? All right, so the first is disposition. Okay, so that means the right to convey that property from one person to another. So question on that, does a person with a mortgage have the right of disposition? The answer is no. You have to be able to, your mortgage company has the right to get paid, so that you can't sell your property without paying off your mortgage. Okay, but D stands for disposition. E stands for enjoyment. Okay, we just talked about enjoyment. Right, and what we said about the enjoyment was that you are able to enjoy your property. They call it quiet enjoyment, but they're not talking about actual quiet. Like you don't have to be quiet on your land. It's just called quiet enjoyment, that you're able to use the property and how you want. Okay, so what's the next E stand for? Okay, I'm going to let you get this one. Okay, and then the last P is for possession, right? You have the right to possess your property. Okay, and then the C stands for, what does the C stand for? The C stands for, let me see, disposition, enjoyment. So one of them is the right to keep people off your land. So that would be possession, that would be DEEPC, control. I think it's control. And then you're drawing a blank out. So am I. I'm trying to think of it. So deep C. So that's going to be our homework. We'll have to get this before we hang up. So disposition, enjoyment. We'll come back to that. Possession and control. So anyway, we'll get back to that. We're missing an E. It's probably going to tell us. So fee simple defeasible means that you would have the right to the property, but the defeasible means that in the event that something happens, exclusion, thank you. So exclusion would be that you can keep people off. So that's our E, right? So then the C might be wrong because I was thinking that was control. So now we're going to get to the close, but E is definitely exclusion, right? You don't have to let people on your property if you don't want. Okay. Now, fee simple defeasible means that there's a condition that means that people can use that property or own that property or whatever if certain events happen. Okay. And I just see if we're going to talk about them a little bit. So fee simple defeasible would be something similar to like a life estate. Okay. Now, in a life estate, what happens generally is that you would grant, let's say, your parents, so you would own the property, right? But you would let your parents stay there until they passed away, and at which time, then what would happen is that house would revert back to you, if that's how you set it up. Okay, so it's an automatic that, when it's defeasible is that it comes back to you. Okay, so that's the fee simple defeasible. So fee simple determinable could be that it's if certain things happen, then it would, then the ownership would change. So in the example on this would be, let's say that a father, gave the rights to possession to his children or to his child, as long as that child, had a good job, right? And in the event that he didn't have a good job, the determinable means that they could determine that the dad could then go back and take possession over it if he didn't have the good job. Okay, so there's some examples of that are in there. So defeasible means that it automatically comes back when something happens. And again, the life estate is a good example. So when the person who you granted the life estate leaves, our earth, basically, then it automatically goes back. Determinable would be that certain conditions are in place, and if they were not kept up, then that person has the right to go back and take ownership. Okay. So different kinds of estates. So the first estate would be estate and land. Okay, so that would be owning land. Now they talk about land a lot of times in here, and not the way that we think of land, right? So in one case, like they talk about improvements, and we're thinking, oh, they cleared away the brush and blah, blah, blah. What they're talking about is generally homes. Okay, so the terminology is a little bit different than what we are used to. A freehold estate. Okay, so a freehold estate means that you own that house basically outright. You have a freehold estate. So freehold estate and non-freehold estate. Freehold estate is you own that property outright. Okay. A life estate. Okay, so we spoke about that life estate earlier. So the life estate would be a situation where it was a fee simple defeasible, right? You grant the rights to that person for the life of their property, but then it reverts back. So I'll give you an example of this, and this is like kind of interesting, and this is something why I always tell people when you are practicing real estate, you always want to go and check the deed when someone says that you're going to be selling their property, right? So some friends of mine, right, their parents called me to sell their property. And again, I've known them since I was a child, and they're like, can you come over and help list our house? And for some reason, I just didn't check the deed because, it was their house, right? So I go there and we list the house and blah, blah, blah. And we're getting ready for the closing. And so the closing attorney says, and so where are, let's just say Deborah and Denise. And I'm like, well, why do you need them? Because those are the daughters, right? They're like, because they own the house. I'm like, they what? And so they had put it in a life estate, but the parents don't, like the people who put them in life estates do not feel that any of their rights have left, right? They still feel like it's their house, even though they don't technically own it anymore, right? Because they just think that they did some stuff with the legal stuff so that they don't have to worry about after they die and the whole, the whole probate type thing, right? They don't think that they have given ownership of their home away, right? As a matter of fact, those owners actually gave me one of their old deeds, and I didn't even check it because I just assumed that they knew what they were doing. So anyways, we had to track down at the last minute those daughters and get them we had to change the paperwork, and we had to get those daughters to sign off and power of attorney and sign the deed and yada, yada, yada. And it was kind of a little bit of a awakening to me again. Now, this just happened a couple of years ago, right? Now, it happened, those kinds of things happened a lot when I started because I didn't know what to look for, but I got sloppy, so it happens all the time. So life estates, they do not know what they're signing. So pour autre vie would be for another, okay? So that would be that you had an estate that you were handling for another person, and again, you do not see a lot of these, but there could be, again, it could be, oh God, what's a good example of pour autre vie for another? It would be, okay, so I guess it could be if there was somebody who, somebody was somebody who was in a nursing home, not a nursing home, say it was somebody who had, a teenage, whatever, somebody who was incapacitated or something, and you were a person who was overseeing their stuff and they were not able to, for whatever reason, take care of it. So the estate is for another, right? And again, so let's go back to my defeasible and determinable. All right, so this is going to go back to my determinable and the difference between a remainder and a reversion. So it could be that when they're setting up, let's just say they're setting up that life estate, right? And so the parents, let's just say that let's just go by generation. So generation 1 would be the elderly. Generation 2 would be the parents that were, that actually own the house now. And then generation 3 would be their kids. Okay. A lot of times, when the generation, so the middle generation, right? So they grant life estate to their parents to stay there. And then they name their children as the beneficiaries after, right? So what would happen is that they own the property when it's to their mother or to their parents or whatever. When the parents pass away, then it goes to their children, either in a trust or or to them, so that way, again, when it comes time for, your succession, you don't have to worry about that. Or the other could be that it reverts back to you, right? And we see a lot of that too. So that would be that they revert the property back to you as the owner, okay? So remainder and reversion are two things that we see. And there's other stories about it, like and on your quizzes, they're like, John White and John Black and John Green, and so they use different things like that. But that to me is not a real life situation. But I can totally see, I think, like I know when we set up my parents' stuff, it was that it would go to the grandchildren, so it's something that you can see there. Now, a legal life estate, again, is what we've been talking about. That is where the person gets to enjoy all the rights, right? So the deep sea rights, which would be, again, the disposition, right? They cannot dispose of it because it's that they don't own it, right? But they can do all the rest. So they can do the enjoyment, the exclusion, right? The possession, and the C, the control. It's going to be control of the property. So anyway, so that would be the legal life estate. All right, a homestead is a life estate, and it's something that essentially states that with the protection of this estate, this life estate, the property of this homestead, is that if creditors were to come, other than the bank, right, they cannot take your property. And there's certain numbers that are in there, okay? So your house is protected for a couple up to $500,000, For individuals, I think it's $250. Now, these numbers might have been bumped up recently. I think they may have been. So you may know a little bit. It is control. Thank you. I'm supposed to know these things, and sometimes I know them and sometimes I don't. So we'll do this together. Generally, I have notes, but I don't have my notes. I forgot my notes. So I'm just doing this off the top of my head. So I'll have my notes tomorrow. Okay, so Homestead. So that's what the Homestead is that it's protection that they won't take your creditors will not take your property when you have an estate, when you have a rights for the Homestead. Okay, now the numbers change a little. I think it's $250 for individual and $500,000 protection for a couple. But you can let me know if I'm off by a little bit. All right, so encumbrances and liens. So when I talked about those liens that were on the property, what I can tell you is that all liens are encumbrances. Okay, so encumbrance is some sort of something on the property that lessens its value, right? But not all encumbrances are liens, right? Liens are the monetary or the financial encumbrances, right? Another example of an encumbrance would be an easement, okay? And an easement would be a right that you are granting somebody for something on your property. And does it go into, okay. I'm going to go back on that one. I was seeing if they gave me better examples. So an easement would be if you gave somebody the ability to drive over your property, right, to get to their house in the back, right? So the law states that people who are landlocked have to have a way to get to their property. So this easement would say that they could drive over your land in order to, you gave them a right of way in order to, or you granted them an easement in order to, go to their back property. So in here, they call it a dominant tenement and a servient tenement. And again, I'm not sure it's in this unit, but so when I thought of this, when I first thought of it, I'm like, well, the dominant one would be the one who owns it, right? Because they're the ones who, they own it. They're the dominant ones. But actually, it's the opposite. And here's how I remember it now. Like, here's the way to remember it. That's not Katie logic. Is that the easement, right? The servient tenant is serving up their land for the other person to drive over it, okay? And so the dominant tenement in this would be the person who's in the back, who's granted the easement to drive over it. And the owner of the land is the servient tenement, okay? They do ask that question a lot because I think it's backwards. The test is very tricky. It's just the way that they ask the questions. All right, so the next is private restrictions, and restrictions could be things that you cannot do, right? So a lot of times there's covenants on a property or there's restrictions like you can, in subdivisions, oftentimes you cannot have pigs or chickens or horses, or you cannot, there's certain colors you have to paint your house. You can't have clotheslines, you can't have campers, you can't have business trucks. There's a lot of different restrictions that they often put on what you can and can't do with your land, okay? And so back to our deep sea enjoyment of the land, right? These restrictions are things that are encumbrances. They're things that minimize what you can do on those bundle of rights. Now, liens, we talked about liens. Liens are the financial things, right? The financial requests that people are going to have on that land at some point in time, okay? So you got liens. So we've got encroachments. Now, encroachments is one of my favorites. Encroachments are the things like that shed that I talked about that, Hurricane Harvey or whatever picked it up and moved it, and now it's encroaching on your land. You go to sell it and say it's the neighbor's shed that's now on your land. What are you going to do? Are you going to make them move it? Are you going to let them keep it there? Is that something that you have to talk with the buyers about? So there's a lot of things that go into that, the questions, right? So there's encroachments. Encroachments can be like trees sometimes like this. So here's the thing. You have houses that are very close together and a tree is growing on one person's property, but all the leaves and all the branches are over hitting the house next door. So that tree is encroaching on their property. And what can they do about that? What do you think they can do about that? Do you want to guess? Okay. So deed restrictions, again, we just talked about those. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs. So these are things that your deed says are restrictions, okay, things that you can and can't do. And this would be, again, this is where the easements would go in. This is where you can't have dogs or chickens or whatever. Those could be in there. It could be, a bunch of different covenants that are part of a subdivision. So hint to you for the future, to making your clients happy is no. Like, know what the restrictions are, what the covenants are, what the conditions are, what can they do, what can't they do? Can they plant, in condos a lot of times, they can't plant trees outside. They can't plant anything that doesn't go by, the homeowners association. There's a ton of things that you can and can't do. And a lot of times they can make or break a sale. I had one where a person wanted to put a horse, and so the CCNR said no horses. So then we went back to see if, like, how long, how old were they, and were they still in place? Because they when they build the property and they create the subdivision, they create them then to try to establish like a flavor for that neighborhood. But after 20 years, a lot of times those covenants are expired unless somebody's on the ball and renews them or changes them or whatever, right? So, okay, so here's always something. So here are different types of easements, okay? And again, deed restrictions. Easement appurtenant, okay? So what is an easement appurtenant? I'm going to give you that one, right? And easement in gross, easement by necessity, and easement by prescription. All right, so I'm going to start on the bottom. So an easement by prescription was, do you remember when I was talking about that you can't have landlocked, right? You have to have an ability to go to the property in the back. So an easement by prescription grants that right, okay? So I sold a piece of cranberry bog in the middle of a couple people's different land. So it was like different, they bordered on, say, 4 people's land. And the way that these people went in all the time to get to their cranberry bog was they crossed over this person's property, and then they crossed over this other person's property to get to their land. Now, there were theoretically other ways they could have gotten there, right? So how do they have the right to go the way that they wanted to go? Okay, easement that runs with the land is an easement appurtenant. Thank you. All right, what's an easement in gross? You can give me that definition too now, while I talk about easement by prescription, and then we'll go back to yours, smarty pants. So easement by prescription. So what the lawyer did was he drew up that his client, so the person who was selling it, for a period of over 30 years, drove his truck to go, at least every other day or every third day to this bog, right? He never asked permission. He always waved at the guy going by. He was never denied to go that way, okay? And he had to get to his bogs because he had to take care of his business, right? So he openly and notoriously used the land, right? They say hostilely because he didn't ask for permission. It was without interruption, okay? And it was a need to get to where he was going, okay? So that's an easement by prescription. So we established this, formalized what this guy had been doing. We formalized it in the deed as it went forward, okay? So that's how he got there. So that's easement by prescription. Easement by necessity is kind of similar, where, like, say the gas company needs to get into the power lines, or they have a power box or whatever. So you see a lot of times there's an easement by necessity, for power purposes. Okay. Now, easement appurtenant, easement that runs with the land. Okay. We're in a waterfront community, right? How many times have you seen in a description deeded beach rights, right? So deeded beach rights means that it runs with the land is that they would have those deeded beach rights that would pass over, right? If it was easement appurtenant. So again, generally we see runs with the land, that would be deeded beach rights. It could also be the power lines for that matter. Okay, now an easement in gross is one that it can use the individuals for as long as they own the property. And I'm going to give you an example here of, so I had a house to sell by on Snippetoot Pond, and it was family land. And now the woman got married and they had this gorgeous house down by the water, and it was family land. So she was having all stages of grief and guilt about moving that, like making it so her sister, who always came down and put her canoe in like this little spot, like it was almost like a little road in between the two houses, and she would come down and put her kayak in and go kayak around to her canoe, I guess, and whatever. So she wanted to put into the deed that her sister could do it for as long as her sister was living, and then it was gone, right? So in the way that they wrote up the title, the deed that I saw, right, is that it was easement appurtenant. That right for her sister to go use that little triangle of land down at the bottom it ran with the land for when this person sold it. Somehow by the time it got signed by the people, it actually became an easement in gross. And what it said was that when these people sold it, they didn't have to keep that easement in there, right? So now it comes time, and now we're flipping it. So what, 5 years later, we're selling it again. And I remember them saying it went with the land, right? Well, when it comes time that it does, it says, no, this says that it's an easement in gross, and that it only goes with the people. And the people who are buying it don't want to grant this woman the right to go use this little road for her canoe. So there was this big issue, and fur was flying. And, it's one of those things, like, we're not lawyers and we don't always know what we're reading in the deeds. And in this case, like, I went on the deed, like I went in my file and I had this deed in front of me, but it was not the deed that was recorded. So it's interesting. And here's the thing is, we never want to say deeded beach rights unless we see in there that it is in fact easement appurtenant and that it runs with the land, right? So you always want to check that. And again, terminating an easement terminates when the need no longer exists. Okay, so let's say that those cranberry bogs, went away, and that they were the person no longer needed to go into there and to get to the cranberry bogs every day or whatever. Or what if that person bought the property in the back and now he or she owned it, and so they wouldn't need that easement for each other, right, for themselves. So there's that possible. Now, the other is when the owner of either the dominant or the servient tenement becomes sole owner of both properties. Okay, so that's kind of what I just talked about, right? So that person who was serving up the land now went and bought that land in the back, so he doesn't need that easement anymore because he owns both, right? By the release of the right of the easement to the owner of the servient tenement. Okay, so again, by the release of the right of the easement to the owner of the servient tenement, right? So that's the owner who serves the thing by. And so say the person who lived in the back, or let's just say that the person who had that cranberry bog now said that, you know what, I don't want to go that way anymore. I want to go out that way, right? So there could be the release of that way. By abandonment of the easement. Okay, so there's an easement right now on a house in Rochester that nobody has used for a long time, and the person says, can we get rid of this easement? Can we clear up this title and get rid of that easement because it's clearly been abandoned? Okay, so that's a possibility, right? By the non-use of a prescriptive easement. Okay, so that's what we talked about. So there's a situation where, well, we'll stay with this one for now. By the non-use of the prescriptive easement. Okay, so definitions: the licenses, personal privileges given for a specific person, right? So you could give someone the license to whatever on the property, right? So you can fill that in from that point in time. Like, you give them the license to use something on there. You give them the license to put a garden up or whatever. So it's personal privileges that you give, right? Encroachments are illegal extensions beyond boundaries of the land. Again, we talked about those, right? So back to my story about the pool and the pool shed and the fence, right? So we were encroaching on that other person's land. Right. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to have so the people buying it said, we're not going to deal with this. Both houses were for sale at the time. They're like, you know what, let's just get this straightened out now. I want the encroachments gone. I want the fence to be in the right spot. I want the shed to be gone or moved, right? They wanted it to be moved because it was a nice shed. So it was just, again, shit show. All right. Lease pending is pending legal action. So a lot of times in a situation where somebody is, let's go say that all right, so you have a buyer and a seller, and for some reason, so let's say that the seller went into the agreement and then wanted to break the agreement and then tried to, for some reason, not execute the deal with this one buyer. They wanted to sell it to somebody else. So the first buyer could go and put a lease pending on that so that person couldn't go sell it to someone until this legal action was done. Right. So this is when people won't give deposits back and they're fighting about deposits. This is what we always scare them with, is like a lease pending. Right. So we are pending legal action that you may or may not be able to move forward because you breached your agreement, right? So anyways, any questions on that? Police power. When they talk about police power, like what I conjure up in my brain is like police coming and being in charge. But police power actually has to do with the government, right? So police power could be the right of the government to execute eminent domain, right? It could be zoning and ordinances. It could be any of those kinds of police powers over your deep sea bundle of rights, okay? So that goes to that control, right, that we have as our C. So eminent domain is the right for the government to come in and take the property for a higher and better use. So the process of this is condemnation. They ask this question on every test. I don't know why. It's not even that good of a question, but they just think it's kind of sneaky because it's the process is condemnation, and then the right for them to do it is eminent domain, right? So when they put a highway in and they need to buy all of the houses or relocate the houses so that they can put it in the straightest path possible, right? So that's eminent domain, the right to do that. Now it's condemnation when they go to all these houses and make them an offer on the house and say, I'm going to buy you out and you're going to give me your land, right? That's the process. Okay, so process is condemnation. The right to do it is eminent domain. And for some reason, they think that's a great question. All right, government powers, taxation. So that's another the government power. Like it's the government has the right to run the town or the city. And so one of the ways they do that is with taxation. Okay, is cheat. So cheat is when someone dies intestate, which is what? What's intestate? So when someone dies intestate, that means that they die without a will, okay? And when they can't find who the decedents are, right, or there are no decedents, then the government or the town or the city gets that property because they can't find any legal heirs. It's called escheat, right? So escheat means that the town gets the property. So a lot of times you'll find, like, again, this is like one of those rabbit holes that people go by, is finding all the properties that are acquired by the town by escheat, because they may be willing to get rid of it because they don't know what to do with it. They have this property, they don't do anything with it. They don't have, it's not like it's this great spot. All right, so our chapter on this, which goes with this, is Interest in Real Estate, Chapter 4, I believe. Again, I'm not going to say any of the numbers with confidence. So a legal life estate. Now, the first one we talked about was Homestead. Now, the other is the dower and courtesy, which is the husband and wife. If the husband dies, then the wife gets his, again, without wills or whatever, notwithstanding, even if she's not on the deed, the wife is owner of the property. Okay, and same thing with if the husband dies. Now, they're all just called dower rights now, or courtesy rights, dower rights, I think. So they got rid of the he and the she. But it was interesting, and this was a rabbit hole that I went down. So what it said was that like if the wife died, then the husband owned the property. But if the husband died, the wife owned a part of that property and the kids own the other part, or something crazy like that. But dower, they're not going to get that crazy on this. They're just going to say, what is a legal life estate, dower and courtesy? That's your spouse, okay? And homestead is the property. And then the easements, we talked about easement by the deed, right? So that's what's in the deed about the easements. Deeded beach rights, is it in the deed, right? Easement by prescription, right? That's my property of my gentleman driving to his cranberry bog, right? Easement by necessity, right? So that would be that they needed that easement for something. Now I'll give you an example, which is not really truly by necessity. Actually, it's more just, I'm going to save the story because it's a good story. And then easement by necessity, power companies, that kind of thing. And again, a license is a personal privilege to generally use something. Okay, so littoral and riparian rights. Now, the way I remember these, and this is kind of goofy, is that L equals littoral, right, which equals lake, right, L and L. And then riparian rights is river, right, riparian, R and R. And I used to think I was so smart for that, and then someone told me that's like what they mean in Greek or something. So streams, ponds, and lakes, and tidal waters, right? The way that you know if they're littoral or riparian is, are they navigable or are they not navigable? Okay, so that's the question when they ask. So when you think about the difference between a lake and a river, generally a lake is self-contained, right? And it's and then a river generally runs into the ocean, right? So riparian rights are generally considered riparian. And then if they're non-navigable, they'd be littoral. And again, streams, ponds and lakes, and tidal waters. All right, so types of tenancy that we talked about. Estate or tenancy for years. So when I say tenancy, generally what we are talking about is leases, right? And you're having some of those bundle of rights, but you don't actually own the property, right? It's not a fee simple estate. Fee simple estate is the highest form of ownership, right? Okay, estate or tenancy for years, we talked about, right? So estate or tenancy for years means that there's a date at the end of it, okay? In estate or tenancy from period to period, oftentimes this is considered like a month-to-month lease, okay? Or what's the other term for it, which would be a tenant at will, right? Would be a period to period. Now the period doesn't have to be a month. It could be year to year. It could be, it's from one period to another. Now, one thing that on the, I'm sorry, so this would be like, again, period to period. If it is a year, there's two different ways of what you'll find in your period to period. If it's a year to year, is a fixed term, right? Which means that this assumption is that on month 13, if nothing's talked about, then you're out. Whereas a self-extending would be the premises that if you never talk about it, then you would be rolling over for another year. Okay, so it goes period to period, year to year. Okay, so a lot of times when it's people are saying, when they're buying a property, can we kick the tenants out? And you want to go check it out, and where are they as far as their tenancy goes? Because if it's a self-extending lease, and even if they only signed it once, they are still bound by that lease, right? Now, estate or tenancy at will, again, this is generally month to month, but it could be any period that, like, whatever that paycheck, that check is that you write for whatever period is what it is. And what I will tell you about this is that you need to give one billing cycle notice in order for either party to either change or end it. Okay, so a lot of times tenants are worried that the landlord's going to up the rent. He doesn't have to wait till the end of 12 months. He can do it anytime he wants. But the other thing is that when people leave, they can leave anytime they want. They just have to do one cycle. Now, if I did a period to period, right, and I stayed after my fixed term lease was over, right, I would be what's called a tenant at sufferance, which means that I am no longer in my 12-month lease, but I didn't leave and I paid my check and he cashed it, or she, right? So now I've established a tenancy at sufferance. This also happens when people literally don't leave, right? And so those are also called holdover tenants, okay? So tenants at sufferance are also called holdover tenants. All right, so some of the common leases that we have are a gross lease. So in a gross lease, it means that everything's covered. Your utilities, your water, your, what's the other one? Your utilities, your water, and your, well, I guess I break it down, like, so your gas and your heat or whatever, and then your power, right? So that's a gross lease. Everything's covered. So I had a gross lease at when I had my business in, actually I have a gross lease right now where I'm the little office that I'm in right now, and I just pay one little lump sum a month, and it never changes. Okay, percentage lease. That would be like the Dunkin' Donuts at Tedeschi's. They get a percentage of money over the profits from Dunkin' Donuts. That's why they encourage it to be a good business there, and they don't put out their own coffee. A graduated lease is something that we often see when someone's taking over a lease. So this was one of the ones I did. So one year it was 800, the next year is 1,000, the next year is 1,200, right? So you graduate up as you're going along. It helps people get going, and it also perhaps is, that it's increasing in value. So what are the obligation of the parties? Okay, again, this is what could be included in any of those things. In a gross lease, the landlord pays it. In a net lease, the tenant usually pays it. So utilities. Okay, again, is it fit for habitation? So this is one of the things that a lot of times people will try and get out of paying their lease by saying that it's not fit for habitation, like there's cold water in the winter, or there's no heat or something. All right, now the gist is you got to get out if it's not fit for habitation. right? Free of sanitary and building code violations. So again, when you hear about like the slumlords, these are some of the things that come up. Like they will say, all right, I'm not paying my rent because there is no power, like there's no hot water. And then they don't leave. And so then they're saying, well, it is habitable because you're staying there. And then they don't pay their rent, and they say that there's this sanitary and building code violations. And so they call. And so there's this whole thing that goes on. Again, I always say that like being a landlord is not for the weak at heart. Okay, avoid waste means like trash and crap like that. You want to make sure that you are not ruining things and whatnot. Again, security deposit, it says 5% interest or whatever the going interest rate is, and it's paid annually. So this is something that has to happen when we're doing a lease, right? And then options. You've heard of leases with an option to buy. An option is basically that it's what we call a unilateral agreement, which means that the landlord is agreeing that they will sell it to that person, but the tenant isn't saying for sure that they're going to buy it. They have an option, right? So one person has agreed to do it and the other person hasn't, essentially, right? Right of first refusal would mean that, before that person sells it, they give the tenant the right of first refusal, right? So a lot of times you'll see things like that. A growing trend is property management, okay? And there's, again, a management division of a lot of real estate companies now, because someone has to take care of these things. Because again, the landlord-tenant stuff is hard. So one of the things is collect rents. The other is prepare reports on what's broken, what needs doing, what got fixed, blah, 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 blah. So they would prepare the reports. Okay, and so any of our miscellaneous stuff, what do we got? Okay, assign versus sublet. So do you know the difference between assign versus sublet? Why don't you give me a little tappity tap on your fingers while I explain it to you? So assign a lease would be that you take your lease and you actually assign it over to somebody else. So somebody else takes over responsibility as the tenant for that landlord. Okay, a sublet would be that you find a tenant to go in there, but you have responsibility still. So you're still the person who's responsible for the landlord. Okay, but you sublet it out to somebody else. So assign means you take yourself out of the equation, whereas a sublet means that you stay in the equation. Okay. Now, a 99-year lease is something that we see in some commercial things, and what they say is anything over 99 years means that the person has a fee simple interest in it, so they would own it, right? So a lot of times you'll see that 99-year lease kind of thing. You'll hear about it. I have never honestly seen one in my business. I don't do a lot of commercial. All right, so I'm going to close up this one. All right, and I will in 5 minutes start the other one. Okay, so we'll go to unit 1 from here. For those who are watching on replay, that probably is not going to be happening for you, but you are certainly welcome if you registered for the next one to watch the next one. So thank you guys, and I will talk to you soon. Okay, any questions before I hang up? No, because I'll see you in 5 minutes. Bye.